Good afternoon, everybody from Geneva. It's Tony Consul, Head of Communications here at IATA. I'm with, in Geneva, our Director General, Alexandre Juniac, but also joined for this very special briefing by Felipe de Oliveira, who's the Director General of ACI World, so our counterpart organization for airports. Today we'll have a statement from Alexandre, followed by a statement from Felipe, and then we will throw it open to questions using the chat function. So please, if you could prepare your questions for the chat function, that would be great. In the meantime, we'll start with Alexandre.
Thank you, Tony. Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you to Luis Felipe de Oliveira, the Director General of Airport Council International, for joining us today. Thank you, Luis Felipe. As we all know, the COVID-19 pandemic continues to devastate the aviation industry. International traffic has all but disappeared. We are carrying only about 10% of normal levels. And domestic travel is picking up in some markets, but it's not enough to sustain the industry. So this crisis is threatening 4.8 million aviation jobs, but the rupture in global air connectivity puts at risk a further 41.2 million jobs across the travel and tourism sector. And that's not even counting the impact on trade and other cross-border businesses that cannot function normally without the connectivity provided by aviation. So the World Health Organization has recognized the broad and severe impact of keeping borders closed. Economies have to open up. People have to work and trade has to resume. Those were the words of Mike Ryan, who heads the WHO Emergencies Program. And then there is the personal impact. Weddings, funerals, graduations, and other important moments have been missed. Families and loved ones are separated and cannot reunite. So as we approach the year-end holiday, the impact of not having the freedom to fly will come into even more painful focus. The aviation industry does not have the magic solution to cure COVID-19, but measures based on global standards are in place throughout the travel process to keep travelers safe. Recent research supports that view that the risk of catching COVID-19 on board is low. That's because of mask wearing combined with design features around airflow, HEPA filtration, and high fresh air exchange rates. And we have a solution to open borders while mitigating the risk of importing COVID-19 through air travel. That is universal testing. There is testing technology that aligns with our requirements for speed, accuracy, affordability, scalability, and ease of use in the travel process. And we are seeing momentum towards implementation. More airlines are introducing testing as a service for their customers to satisfy specific entry requirements or to avoid quarantine. Some airlines are running trials to collect data on the efficiency of testing. Some airports have also introduced testing programs. There are advanced proposals to open the New York-London route with pre-departure testing of all passengers. And the European Union is looking at proposals for testing at various risk level to open Europe's internal borders to travel. These initiatives are providing valuable experience in the use of testing to travel safely and prevent the importation of COVID-19. The next step is agreement among governments on the standards needed for them to open their borders with testing as a replacement for quarantine measures. So after the successful implementation of the ICAO card guidance to safe operations amid COVID-19, we are encouraging CARD to urgently find agreement among governments on a way forward for testing. In the meantime, we cannot ignore the industry's continuing financial trauma. Many governments have done a very good job in financially supporting aviation jobs. While this has not happened, in Latin America, for example, we see bankruptcies. Most government aid packages were put together assuming that the industry would be in recovery by now. The recovery has not happened, and airlines will struggle to make it through the normally weak Northern Hemisphere winter season. So we have renewed our call for financial support, and it is urgent. As we said last week, airlines continue to burn through cash, and that is expected to persist into next year. Without a second tranche of financial aid, many airlines will not make it through the winter. Ramping up the industry when the recovery happens will be challenging enough. If airlines need to be resurrected from bankruptcy, the pain of the economic recovery will be extended with severe consequences for employment in the sector. Airlines must be financially viable for aviation to be able to lead the recovery, and financially viable partners are needed across the sector, including airports. To help me emphasize the point that government must think holistically about this crisis that crosses the industry, I am joined by Felipe de Oliveira, the Director General of ACI, and I turn the floor to him.
Great, thanks, Alexandre. Luis Felipe, you're on. You have the floor.
Yes, thank you, Alexandre and IATA for this joint press conference. Good morning from Montreal. Air transport has always been an industry based on the interdependence of all its parts. We value the working relationship we have with our partners, and we are glad to participate in today's press conference. The COVID-19 crisis has devastated the entire aviation ecosystem. We are here with our airline partners with two objectives today: to reiterate the call for assistance from governments to safeguard millions of jobs and protect essential operations, and urge governments to follow a coordinated and consistent approach to testing as an alternative to the blunt instrument of restrictive quarantine measures. Airports are vital cogs for this ecosystem, remain important engines of economic growth, wealth creation, and employment. Airports generate 60% direct employment in the aviation sector, and the recovery of air travel is crucial in the wider global economic recovery. The airport industry is anticipating minus 59.6% reduction in passenger volumes, which equates to a reduction of passengers of 5.6 billion only in 2020, and reflecting a revenue reduction of $104.5 billion for 2020, with the heavy impacts on the airport business. To see through the dramatic decline in the traffic and revenue, airports need urgent relief and assistance, with also to help the restart operations and help lay the foundation of the balanced recovery. Governments are also urged to support the financial viability of the industry through direct financial support that benefits the entire aviation ecosystem. This is an existential crisis, and airports, airlines, and commercial partners need a direct and swift financial assistance to protect essential operations and jobs. Measures to put forward by ACI to foster recovery includes short-term loans or one-time cash injections to minimize the full debt and credit losses. Airport rents and concessions fee applicable to airport operations should be waived in the form of one-time measure for a defined period of time. Regulators should pursue temporary relaxation of the limits and allowance for selective duty-free products. Additionally, and in accordance with World Health Organization's international health regulations, ACI believes costs related to public health measures aimed at mitigating the spread of communicable diseases should be borne by national governments. But this is not all. To succeed even with this assistance, passengers must have the confidence in the industry to focus on their health and welfare. As airports restart, when prepared to sustain continued operations, they will be focused on the health and welfare of the travelers, staff, and the public, and to illustrate that air travel is safe and does not pose a risk to the public health. ACI and IATA are aligned in a call for urgent government action to introduce widespread and coordinated testing of passengers to enable quarantine requirements to be removed. Governments must cooperate to remove quarantine restrictions and restart air travel. A coordinated approach to COVID-19 testing will provide an effective way to give governments the confidence to reopen borders without quarantine. We want an international agreed and recognized approach to testing passengers during the travel process that is fast, practical, accurate, low cost, easy to use, and supported by public health authorities. This will be foster recovery among the airports, airlines, and the travel tourism sectors, thereby protecting jobs and providing the economic and social benefits that aviation delivers to local, national, and global communities it serves. Collaboration, cooperation, and consistency across the aviation industry will be the key to rebuild global air services capacity and keeping passengers safe, healthy, and secure at this sector sustainable as we do this. We need to work together across the industry and hand with the ICAO and international health organizations to ensure coordinated recovery while providing crucial resurgence to travelers. As an industry, we look to the ICAO Council Aviation Recovery Task Force to provide guidance that can be adopted at national level, which is consistent and complementary. Thank you very much.
Great. Thank you very much, Felipe. So with that, we'll open it up for questions. Once again, a reminder that we will take questions via the chat function. So please type in your questions and we'll get to them in order. We already have a few in the queue. So we'll start in order. And the first question is concerning testing, and particularly some of the airlines and airports that are already doing testing. Which examples are there of airlines or airports that are doing pre-boarding testing? And secondly, will the data collected from these tests of testing capabilities be published? So maybe, Alexandre, we'll start with you, and then we'll turn it over to Felipe to give his comment.
There are experiments that are conducted in Rome, in Frankfurt, in London, in some Gulf countries, in the US, between Hawaii and the US territory, in Canada, in Asia. So there are several and different various examples that we will use to gather data and to be able to draw the conclusion and consolidate our system. That is to propose, the system that will be based on this data, safe, manageable, scalable, etc. So it's for us very good cases to illustrate what we are proposing. So we will use them for the publication. We'll have to see if it will have to be published, but it will certainly be used as a test case to illustrate what we are proposing.
Correct. And in fact, Air Canada has published some of the data they've already collected from their testing. Felipe, did you have something to add to that?
Yes, I was especially mentioning that Air Canada and GTAA Toronto Airport are doing the joint efforts to test the passengers as a voluntary basis, and that will come very shortly. I think the very good results that shows the good example to share all over the world. Apart of that, many airports and different airports and airlines are working together in different parts of the world some airports like Bogota in Latin America, Guarulhos in São Paulo, and others like Brussels airports and many others are also having testing facilities in the airport or being very close in the airport area to provide the testing facilities to the passengers, and of course use this data to prove the studies that are conducted to provide better results to the governments to take the right actions regarding tests versus quarantine.
Okay, thanks, Felipe. We have another question. It's asked in the Africa context, but I suppose it's applicable elsewhere as well. The questioner asks, what can we do to ensure that tests in one country are accepted by the airport or the authorities on arrival in the destination country? So, Alexandre, I suppose that speaks to the need for CART to come up with some global standards for this, but maybe you want to elaborate?
So we have to lobby in favor of a global standard applicable everywhere. So supported and recognized by by most governments.
Okay. Felipe, did you have anything you want to add to that?
Yeah, I believe that is the global standard will be used. And if you see, for example, the yellow fever, the vaccines that we have, a simple paper can prove that you have tested, for example, will be the right to use that is world recognized as well. That's why there is a lot of ways to do that, but we need to have a global standard that the CART and the CAPSPA could be working on that.
Great, thank you. And just as a clarification for those listening, CART and CAPSPA are various organizations or structures that have been put in place in the case of CAPSPA prior to the crisis, in the case of CART during the crisis, to bring together the relevant organizations to do precisely that, look at the needs of the industry in order to operate safely and then provide the global guidance necessary. We have a question asking about, well, it's for you, Felipe. It's asking about airports specifically. And it says that we've heard much about the danger of airlines becoming bankrupt and having to close in the face of the crisis. What's the situation with airports? Is there really a chance that airports could have to close because of a lack of income or business activity?
Thank you. A very interesting question. Before the crisis, around 65% of the airports around the globe were working in the deficit. And nowadays, all the airports in the world are working in a deficit. That's why, of course, we have a great possibilities to have airports going to the bankruptcy in the short and medium term, especially the small ones, because as airlines restart the flights, of course, we usually focus on the big hubs, and the small airports probably will suffer a little bit more, a long time on this recovery, and that could come with some fatalities. A lot of airports in the world is still owned by the governments as well, and that, of course, can bring a little bit of a long-term for these institutions. However, the private airports could suffer much more or need to be increase their debts to survive during these difficult times. That's why, yes, we could see airports going to the bankruptcy in a very short period of time.
Okay, thank you. Alexandre, did you have anything you wanted to add to that commentary? No. Okay, great, thanks very much. We have a question about, I suppose, just the state of progress. So, Alexandre, you named a few testing cases and such, but do you feel that there's enough being done on this quickly enough, or would you be expecting more testing programs, more activity by now on the introduction of universal testing?
No, I would first, I think that we are doing whatever we can, airports and airlines, to test, to organize, the right experiment based on the most recent technologies that meet the criteria we have set for this type of tests. So I'm not sure there is an ideal number. We have to do it, full stop.
Okay. And Felipe, how about yourself? Do you think we're moving fast enough on this?
We are doing as the same as Alexandre commented. We are doing as everything as you can. However, until the tests are valid to eliminate the quarantine, for example, is not useful. That's why we need to have these tests that really have international acceptance, and of course reduce the quarantines and improve the level or the number of the passengers traveling. That's why, of course, we can move even faster if we have a clear mandate from the governments that tests are a tool to improve the air transport.
Okay, thank you. We have a question on the cost of the test. In the U.S., this is being borne primarily by the travelers. Are there cases in other countries such as Canada or Italy that have a different charging model in place? And I suppose, what is the preference for the industry? Felipe, you address cost. Maybe you want to take this one first?
Yes. According to WHO, any kind of measure that need to be founded by health measure need to be founded by the governments. But of course, we understand the difficult sometimes from the governments to take these decisions to fund the test. That's why I believe the passengers are today the ones that are covering the costs of the tests to allow them to travel. The good stuff is that with the technology improvements, the tests are turning cheaper and are reducing the price, and that, of course, is an advantage for all of us on this restarting of the industry. That's why valid tests that are cheap and affordable for the travelers will be the right move, and of course will help the governments to take the right decision when they need to funding the tests as well, because it will be low cost for them as well.
Okay, thanks, Felipe. I can also add that IATA has done some research with customers, asking them who they expect to pay for these tests. And the number one response is governments followed by passengers. So clearly what you said is also aligned with passenger expectation. We have a question about a specific project called the Commons Project, which is, as I understand, a grouping of Cathay Pacific and United who are testing the Common Pass on a route from, I believe it's New York to Hong Kong. And the question is basically, are there any comments on that? Is this type of sort of travel bubble or experimental structure between 2 points helpful, I guess, in the overall push to restart the industry?
It's always helpful, to experiment everything that helps to restart the industry. The point is that it's a very good move. It goes in the right direction, particularly if successfully shows that it is possible to restart and to fly again some routes. The point is that at the end it should come to a common system, or according to lead to a common standard to avoid the network to be too complex or too difficult to manage. But that's good initiative. We are supporting that.
Okay. Yes. So we have a question about airports in so basically the question asks about regions that have a higher chance of going bankrupt. So we've talked a little bit about airlines in areas where governments haven't provided support. And the questioner is asking, are there any specific regions or countries, Felipe, that you're worried about from the airport perspective?
Well, we have the pandemic is affecting globally the airport industry. As I mentioned, there is some regions that we have the governments owners of the airports. That's, of course, affect a lot, but it's very difficult to see an airport be closed by a government, and that we have this possibility to have airports suffering more in the regions like Canada, we have Latin America, Europe, and certain regions in Asia. That's why it's a mix of regions and expectations. The airports are infrastructures that are constructing for a long term. That's why you cannot see an airport really easily closing, because that infrastructure is constructed for an airport. The runway is constructed for an aircraft to land, and is a typical infrastructure that cannot be converted in another infrastructure. And that is something that will receive, of course, certain inputs from our members that they need to continue operating that infrastructure for as long as they can, because it's a long-term investment. However, of course, the private investors at certain point will run out of cash if they don't have any support from the government or any financial lines that will allow them to continue to work and provide the service to the communities.
Okay, thanks, Felipe. We have the similar question with respect to airlines. Alexandre, there are certain areas that you're particularly concerned of or about with respect to potential bankruptcies?
I think no areas can be protected from bankruptcy, but there are perhaps two continents or subcontinents that are particularly exposed, that are Latin America and Africa, because governments have not implemented enough or any financial support for the airlines. So in these two subcontinents, the airlines are really struggling for survival.
Okay, thanks, Alexandre. We also have Brian Pierce, our chief economist, on the line. Brian, did you have anything you wanted to add to that?
I think those points were the main ones to make, because in this crisis, every airline is an airport is really struggling, as the passenger business has more or less disappeared, certainly for international markets. Airlines are on life support, and in those regions where governments have stepped up and provided such support, for instance in North America and Europe. But as Alexandre said, we are concerned with regions like Latin America, where we've already seen some airlines going into bankruptcy as a result of the crisis.
Okay, thanks, Brian. We have a question about the calls for financial support as the crisis drags on. There was an earlier tranche of support in the springtime where governments provided, and Brian, correct me if I'm wrong, I think it was about 160 billion in funding to airlines. The question is, what did we learn from that? And are there certain types of assistance that are more effective than others? And how is that reflected in our current calls for additional support?
First of all, we are pretty grateful about governments supporting financially the airlines. They have done a good job. But considering the fact that the crisis lasts, we need another tranche. What we have learned from the first tranche, in which we were pushing all instruments going from grants to loans to capital injection to cash injection, is that we should avoid or refrain in using the debt tool to finance the airlines, at least the airlines. I don't speak about the airports, but the level of indebtedness of the airline is already too high. So we urge government to use any instruments but the debt to finance their plan to support the airlines.
Great, thank you, Alexandre. Felipe, did you have anything you wanted to add to that?
And the only countries that we, as an airports, receive some support was U.S. With some grants from the federal government, and of course in certain countries in the Scandinavia as well. And most of these grants and support end up keeping the jobs and of course helping to restart the industry. Any kind of support that comes in the both ways for airlines or airports will help us to continue to operate and reduce the cost of the travel, especially during these difficult times. And of course, any kind of lack of support for the industry at all will generate that will take even longer to recover. And of course, seeing a lot of job losses in the short and medium term. That's why the government support needs to come to keep the jobs and help us to restart the industry. And in addition, of course, we need to have this global approach on the testing to support restart the industry, because it doesn't matter if you have financial support now, but we continue with the lockdowns and quarantines around the globe. This support will be shortly used, and we want to be able to survive in the medium and long term. That's why we have the short term that is now, and also the need to restart the operations, and that of course will support the economies of the airports, airlines, and the economies that we serve as well.
Okay, thanks, Felipe. We have a question about the how the testing function fits into other measures that are being put in place to keep keep flying safe during the COVID crisis. And specifically, they're saying, what other measures are airlines and airports implementing? I know there's a whole raft of them that have been recommended as a result of the CART process, but maybe, Felipe, you want to take that in terms of what's being implemented in airports?
Yes, thank you. The airports, we work together with the industry, and of course with IATA, WHO, ICAO, on the CART document that was released in the last June. The idea from ACI, we developed and implemented the airport health accreditation. That is a tool that we support and help the airports to implement all the CART measures, all the ICAO international measures on health, hygiene, and safety at the airports during this crisis. And we have a huge amount of the airports around the world that has been accredited. And that include many areas like social distancing, use of alcohol gel, availability of alcohol gel, and another aspects from the airport side that you can guarantee to the governments and bring the travelers the confidence, and the users of the airport and the workers at the airport as well, that we are doing everything we can to keep the airport a safe and a health place for them to pass through. We already reach around more than 400 airports that apply for the system, for the accreditation. We have around 170 airports that are under review right now, and plus more than 70 airports around the globe that already have the accreditation. And that it brings the confidence to the governments that we are following the international standards in terms of the health and hygiene. And for the public, the same standard will be seen in different parts of the world, in different airports of the world, and that brings a little bit more confidence for them to travel. That is the actions that we are doing as an airports.
Great, thanks, Felipe. Alexandre, I know you've traveled quite a bit even during the crisis with the new measures. Maybe from the passenger perspective, what should they expect in the travel process?
The measures that have been recommended by CART 1, that were the takeoff guidelines, are pretty simple, easy to implement, and they are not creating an additional burden for passengers. Even the mask that, for which we have seen sometimes some reluctance from passenger, is very well and universally accepted. So it's I'm not worried about the implementation of these measures. What we are proposing with testing is an additional step that should take place before departure or at departure airport. If we use the new antigen test that give the result in less than 15-20 minutes, it will be an additional step that will not, again, put an additional or unbearable burden on the shoulders of the passengers. And knowing that our surveys show that passengers are ready to be tested massively, almost 85% of them are ready to be tested, or consider that testing should be an essential part of their journey. So it was one of the criteria we choose to propose this system, was that it would be manageable, not only viewed from the airline, but viewed from the passenger, and it is the case.
Correct. And in fact, when we've done passenger surveys asking what passengers who have traveled during the COVID, since the COVID measures have been put in place, so since June, we had a very strong response. 86% either strongly or somewhat agreed that the measures made them feel safe and that they were well implemented. So I think that speaks, loudly to the acceptance of passengers of the measures. We have a question concerning the timing of our call for the testing regime to be implemented. We're making it and strengthening that call at a time when many countries in Europe and elsewhere are experiencing spikes in the number of coronavirus cases. And I guess the question is asking, how does that bode for our optimism that governments will look and trust testing as a solution to reopen borders, given the rising number of cases? Alexandre, maybe you want to take that one first?
We are trying to reach the results within ICAO to implement this testing process by the end of October. That would be the best possible outcome we can reach. Of course, the resurgence of some infections, or cases of infections in Europe, is not an easy, does not ease the implementation of the adoption and implementation of the process. But the real point there is that this process is designed to limit, to minimize at a very acceptable level the risk of transferring the virus between countries, from country A to country B. So, and it is based on a risk-based approach, which means that we live with the virus because that's the reality in which we live. It is not a process that is designed to be implemented in a zero-virus environment, or zero-virus countries. But it is there to strictly limit the risk of contamination under a level that keeps the virus under control. That's the key element. And so we think that if countries adopt this approach, and I think it is the reasonable one, we think it's the reasonable one, and apparently it is the one that is also recommended by WHO, so by the highest medical authorities. This process should be adopted in a reasonable time frame. It's what we are going to advocate in favor with governments, and especially in Europe, in which we see a resurgence of the virus.
Okay, thanks, Alexandre. Felipe, did you have any response to the question, which was basically asking how optimistic we are in making this call amid the spike in coronavirus cases?
Yes, I support Alexandre's comments, and basically we are not an environment free of the COVID. We need to have the COVID in the environment that we are. And what we are doing is mitigating at a very, very low risk of the transmission during the travel process, And I think that is the guarantee that the travel process from the boarding to the travel to the arriving in the destination is a very low risk that any passenger will contract the virus during this time. And of course, the tests allowed us to have the free environment on the aircraft, considering that the times of the transmission of the virus and the tests that are applied, of course, recognized by the World Health Organization, provide us that guarantee, and that is the way that we are working. We cannot stop aviation, but we can reduce the risk and, of course, restart the industry from the levels that we are today, keeping business, keeping families united, keeping people circulating in our globalized world.
Okay, thanks, Felipe. We have a couple of questions about an announcement from the European Council on essentially a coordinated way of mapping the risk of COVID across Europe with some implications for travel. And the questions are asking whether we are satisfied with this as a step forward, or are there other measures that need to be implemented? Alexandre, can I throw that one to you first?
Yeah, no, we are not satisfied by the decision of the European Council, because we were expecting the Council to at least to be open to replace quarantines by testing or by any solution, adapted solution. We were recommending that the member states will not refuse entry to citizens traveling from another member state. When we were in favor of border opening between countries that have the similar, infection rate. We were also in favor of questioning seriously the effectiveness of quarantine. It's not the case. Whether the ECDC was in favor of probably removing quarantine, provided we are able to propose something else. And we were asking also European government, to give sufficient delay before adopting some restriction measures to give to travelers and to transportation, companies enough time to adapt or to react, and it's not the case. So we are pretty disappointed.
Yeah, I think that's quite clear. It missed the mark on a number of issues. Felipe, I know this is something hot off the press here in Europe, but ACI Europe has made some comments on it. Did you want to add anything to the industry's disappointment in this particular announcement?
Yes, the industry is very disappointed, and I echo the words from Alexandre on that. There is no measures that really open the borders again. That's why the simple question that we agree that pushed for a common pre-departure COVID testing was not really implemented, because we still have there is no proposal to replace quarantines by testing, for example, even in the European Union. And that's something that is killing the aviation industry in the region. We have a good start of the summer, but now going really, really down again. And Europe is going back to the closed market for aviation. And all the expectations that we have from the European Union were not addressed effectively in this communication from them.
Okay, thanks, Felipe. And I should note that there is a joint statement by IATA, A4E, and ACI Europe, which is outlining specifically our concerns with this. So I would encourage any journalist that's interested in that to have a look at the statement. We have another question looking specifically at the Middle East. And the question is, what are the prospects or major concerns for airlines operating in the Middle East, and also on the financial aspects for airports? So perhaps for airlines, I turn it over to Brian and say, are there any specific trends that are concerning you about Middle East performance in the crisis?
I think the biggest issue facing the Middle East airlines is that they have been the super connectors, at least in the Gulf region, the super connectors for the world on long haul markets. And long haul travel is the most difficult of the markets to open at the moment because of government concerns and the lack of the acceptance of an effective testing regime. So the sooner that we can get testing in place, I think that would certainly help the key markets that those super connecting airlines in the Gulf would serve.
Okay. Felipe, did you have anything to add to that?
Yeah, completely agree with Brian. The airports in the Middle East are connectors, and basically without international travel that is heavily affected by the restrictions, we see a lot of reduction on the traffic, and of course a cash burner for these airports in the region as well. So until we don't recover from international traffic, we still seeing airports in the region suffering because of the lack of domestic markets, of course, except from Saudi Arabia that have a reasonable and good domestic market. The other ones basically doesn't have a domestic market, and of course that's affect them a lot.
Okay, thanks, Felipe. We have just a couple more questions and only a few more minutes, so if you have questions, please submit them quickly. We have a question asking about loss figures for airlines and for airports. Maybe I'll turn that to Felipe first. Do you have any? You've talked about the revenue loss, but not necessarily the net losses that airports might experience. Do you have any figures on that?
No, we don't have the figures. I have the loss on revenues, but I don't have the figure here. We can get the information and send to you as well.
Okay.
In a few hours, yeah.
Okay, thanks. And Brian, I know you have a tally. I believe the last time we looked at that was in June. Do you have any comments on that?
Yes, that's right. I mean, we in the face of an extraordinary loss of passenger revenues, we in June thought the industry would be losing between 80 and 90 billion dollars, wiping out the profits of many decades. But even that was based on an expected recovery in the second half, which doesn't seem to be materializing. We did some estimates recently looking at the rate at which airlines are reducing their balances of cash or burning through cash, which we know was around $50 billion in the second quarter alone. We reckon it's going to be in the region of sort of $77 billion in the second half of this year.
Okay. Thanks, Brian. And I think we have maybe one last question here, which is, we'll end on an optimistic note. China Southern Airlines is planning to buy more aircraft and engines. How do you see this in the context of the current crisis? And what's the general, I imagine this goes against the general trend of airline purchases of aircraft at this point in time. But Alexandre, do you have any comments on that?
No, the comment that the appetite to flight is still there. So when the market is open, we see passengers coming back massively on our aircraft, and that is the case of the Chinese domestic market, in which the figures are approaching the 2019 levels. So the traffic has restarted because the internal borders are open, and the safety measures are in place and are not deterring passengers to travel at all. So it means that whenever governments will remove the restrictions and replace them with safe and reasonable and manageable measures to prevent COVID transmission, the traffic will restart.
Great. Thanks, Alexandre. Felipe, did you have any last words or thoughts you want to put out there before we call this to a close?
Yes. Regarding the domestic markets, we are seeing some started of travel in the domestic markets. We see some good numbers in China, Brazil, even US, and other countries as well that have huge domestic markets. That's why we are happy to see certain kind of developments, and that's the positive news. And we, as a globalized world, we need to still traveling. I don't see a world without aviation. I don't see that we will come back to the times when you need to cross the ocean with the boats, and the trade and the importance of the tourism for many different parts of the world are very very important. And in that way, I believe that we will recover. I think the domestic market is showing a sign of the recovery. We just need to be united and aligned and work together, that the decisions that are taken in the aviation are decisions based on the risk assessment, based on the tools that are available to provide us the best outcome as possible in terms to provide us the travel are safe, and travel are important to keep the economies and keep the support of this recovery of the economies around the world, as aviation play a key and important role on that, in tourism, in trade, in business, in connecting families, and I think that is the important message we like to pass. Hope that these good signs in domestic markets will translate in good signs for international markets as well shortly. And we started the recovery process that will really take long. We are now expecting that the recovery will come back only on the 2024. Of course, in different parts of the world could be a little bit early, but in the overall industry will come back on the 2019 levels only after 2024. Thank you.
Great. Thanks, Felipe. There are no more questions in the queue. We're just about at the hour, so it leaves me just to say thank you, everyone, for participating.